In our lesson for May the 22nd, we continue our study in the book of Acts, and we're going to look at another of the great characters in the book of Acts. We looked at Dorcas in last week's lesson, and we've looked at Philip and Stephen, some of the deacons, and of course we've talked about Peter and John, the disciples. But today we're going to look at an outsider like the Ethiopian eunuch, a Gentile, who becomes a Christian in dramatic encounters between him and Peter. And we need to remember that Luke is writing here the story of the first century church, not in a chronological way or even in a journalistic way, but what we might call an epical way. He does different pictures, different epochs, and brings them together. So he, as I said, he talked about Philip, and Philip went to this other place, and then he doesn't tell the rest of the story. We see that all the way through. But there is one central theme now that ties all of these epics together, and that is the power, the barrier-breaking power of the gospel. We've already seen that in some of the earlier stories, but what happened then was pretty incidental. Philip escaped to Samaria, and while he was there, he preached. Then the disciples were run out of Jerusalem, and as they went, they spread the gospel. So it's kind of incidental. But what we see now is a deliberate movement by the church to open the gospel to the Gentiles. And that happens now in this story with Cornelius. So look in your outline. Let's look first of all at Cornelius, chapter 10, verses 1 through 2. At Caesarea is a city located on the plain of Sharon in northwest Palestine on the Mediterranean Sea. It was named, of course, for Caesar, one of the Caesars, Augustus Caesar, and it was kind of the provincial capital for Herod during this period of time. In the city of Caesarea, there were obviously Roman soldiers, and a group of 600 of these soldiers was called a cohort. And so there was a cohort of soldiers, 600 Roman soldiers in the city of Caesarea, and these soldiers, of course, were scattered throughout the Roman Empire as well. These cohorts were broken down into groups of 100. And over each of these groups of 100, the commanding officer was referred to as a centurion because he ruled over 100 troops. Cornelius is one of these centurions. And traditionally, during this period of time, the centurions were considered to be prudent, good leaders. They had a good, they were looked at with respect by the people of that day. And Cornelius now is one of these. So first thing we see when it says in verse 1, there was a man named Cornelius who is a centurion, the first thing we know is that he's an upright citizen. He's an okay guy. He's got good character. He's got good reputation. That's the first thing we learn. But Luke focuses not on his character as a Roman centurion, but rather on his faith. And he says in verse 2, he and his family were devout and God-fearing. Now remember, we've talked about that phrase in a couple of earlier lessons. A God-fearer was a Gentile who was attracted to the Jewish faith, partly because of its monotheism, its worship its belief in one God, partly because of its structure and its tradition, partly because of the high ethical standards of those who followed the Jewish law. For these reasons, there were many who were drawn to the Jewish faith. Now, many of these did not convert to Judaism because it would have affected their life in such a dramatic way. They were not willing to do that, but they were drawn to the Jewish faith. Cornelius and his family seem to be among these God-fearers. But he also was a very generous person. If you look at verse 3, it says, verse 2, He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. So this is the picture of Cornelius. Upright man, well respected in the Roman Gentile community, but also a God-fearer who displayed in his life the compassion of those who believed in God, Yahweh, and who, in a sense, was attracted to the whole Jewish religious thing. So that's the picture of Cornelius as the story opens. Now, in verse 3, it says, one day about 3 in the afternoon, he had a vision, and he distinctly saw an angel, and verse 3 follows on verse 2, which says he was praying. So Luke tells us while he was praying, he had this vision. It reflects, I think the story reflects